Today, everyone, we managed to close out the development of ironclads in the Royal Navy. It's only taken us 5 years since I published the first video on the subject, but never mind. As the 1870s drew to a close, the Royal Navy was facing several challenges in terms of technology and ship design. Up until this point, most capital ship construction had basically agreed you needed heavy armour and big guns, and the big guns would be protected by even more armour, with turrets more recently beginning to win out over central batteries. But now there were two new radical takes on capital ship design. The French had started building ships where the guns were high-mounted thanks to the use of open barbettes, which saved huge amounts of weight compared to the turrets, albeit in theory leaving the gun crew somewhat vulnerable. And the Italians had gone even further with the design of the Ironclad Italia, dropping essentially all armour in favour of big guns and high speed, plus a lot of subdivision. The whole speed versus armour thing was actually somewhat viable at this point, since the close-range nature of gun battles and the slow speed of turret traverse meant that a high-speed vessel might very well cause problems for a slower ship that was trying to track it. The other issue was more specific to the Royal Navy. Armour had both moved on from pure iron to compound armour, which was still mostly iron but with a steel face on it, and it had grown absurdly thick. The weight of short-barreled guns of the time was reaching rather silly levels as they got larger and larger, and attempting to move on to 19 or 20-inch weapons would be somewhat questionable simply because there was no guarantee they'd actually fit on any reasonably sized ship of the time. Gunmakers had instead developed a new form of gunpowder to try and address the problem. This new form was very large-grained relative to the earlier powder, and thus it burned slower than the finer powders used previously. This allowed a sustained pressure to be exerted on the shell, which accelerated it consistently as it travelled down the barrel. The only problem was that with the existing short barrels of 15 to 20 calibers in length, the barrel itself ended before the charge had finished burning. This meant that, firstly, a good deal of potential energy in the charge was being wasted, and it led to burning unspent powder being blasted across the deck of the ship in question, which wasn't particularly good for anyone. On land, experiments had shown that if you lengthened the barrel of a slightly smaller gun, you could obtain a significantly higher velocity, and thus overall far more kinetic energy, if you used this new slow-burning powder, than the energy of even the largest 100-ton or 17.7-inch gun using the older powder, which tended to give a massive initial kick before then rapidly burning out. They also discovered that if you made the powder chamber somewhat larger than the actual charge that went into it, you could burn even more powder without increasing the pressure levels further to dangerous extents where the gun might explode. But with the greater amount of powder that you could now burn, you had even more burn time and thus even higher velocities on your shell. The problem for the Royal Navy was that it had very rapidly gone back to muzzle-loading guns after a brief flirtation with breech loaders in the early 1860s, and neither of these advances could really be used with muzzle-loading guns. The increased chamber was rather hard to make if you were boring out a muzzle loader, because the chamber was at the far end, and it was even harder to use, since of course you'd have no real control over what exactly the charge ended up doing if you stuffed it down a barrel and it reached a larger chamber at the far end of said barrel. And the longer barrels that you needed to increase the muzzle velocity made reloading from the muzzle end far more impractical, as the guns of this kind of length would not be able to fully recoil into a turret without the turret becoming almost as wide as the ship itself, or in the case of the larger guns of the type you might find on a battleship, the external loading mechanisms which had been developed for ships like Inflexible would both become much larger and need to be moved some distance from the turrets, again taking up far too much room. Both of these problems would be solved by adopting breech loading, which allowed direct access to the powder chamber, required much shorter ramming and loading equipment, which could then be housed inside the turret, if it could be adapted far enough, and in a quality of life upgrade, it also meant that you didn't need to have freshly smoking muzzles coming back inside the gun house. The gun could exude its residual smoke, which was considerable in black powder weapons, somewhere outside. While the Royal Navy's paranoia about large-scale breech loaders had been sparked by early guns' ability to fire without the breech actually being fully closed, Elsick appeared to provide a solution. They considered foreign approaches, as other navies had been using breech loaders for some time at this point, and they decided that Krupp's sliding breech block system was far too close to the Armstrong system that had caused the issues in the first place that had caused the Royal Navy to abandon the idea. Instead, they adopted the French Navy's interrupted screw system, with multiple safeties installed that physically prevented the gun from firing unless the breech was fully closed. This would allow the caliber length of guns to grow from the 15 to 20 calibers of typical muzzle loaders of the period to 25 calibers in the new 12-inch breech-loading rifled gun, a length that admittedly was largely dictated by what available space there was on the ships already being sketched out. Longer calibers could also be manufactured, and this gave the smaller and lighter 12-inch gun similar or better penetration than guns that were more than double its weight. Now, this isn't to say the transition was smooth. A combination of Treasury bean counters ignoring naval requests for the numbers of guns and the amount of ammunition they actually needed slowed things down, as did rather obsolete working practices and a refusal to adapt by some gun manufacturers, including the Royal Ordnance Works. Still, the next generation of Royal Navy ironclads was underway, and in the mid-1880s a certain Captain Fisher would be made Director of Naval Ordnance, and he would be able to clear things up somewhat. The first class of ironclads that would be built with the new breech-loading guns would be the Colossus class, made up of two ships, the Colossus and Edinburgh, which were built to similar dimensions as the Navy's previous battleships of similar layout. They had four 12-inch breech-loading rifled guns in a pair of twin turrets, all contained in an amidship citadel, with the turrets mounted en echelon, the portside guns being forward, the starboard guns being further aft. A small battery of just 5 single 6-inch guns was installed on the superstructure that was at either end beyond the turrets, one pair on either side of each superstructure section, and with one lone gun aft, along with a pair of small above-water torpedo tubes. Compound engines allowed for up to 16 knots, with 18 inches of compound armour on the citadel's side, 16 inches enclosing the fore and aft bulkheads, and the turrets had 14 inches of armour, with an additional 2 inches installed over the faceplates. The ships also introduced a lot of steel into their basic structure, which allowed them to keep displacement to just over 9,000 tons. There were still some anachronisms with the ships, though. With all the issues experienced developing the guns themselves, relatively little thought had been given to the loading mechanisms, and so the older external loaders that had been used on ships like Inflexible, which rammed shells and charges into the gun muzzles outside of the gun turret, were copied. They were just mounted lower down, and so they came up underneath the turret, and of course they loaded the breech instead of the muzzle. There was also the issue of bow design. While Bellerophon's rather impressive bow wave had recently been superseded by Neptune, the Colossuses then stole the title from Neptune with a 13-foot-high solid wall of water that seemed to rise up and then not drop for some considerable distance aft, with one officer, seeing Colossus underway on trials, noting that the like of this has never previously been observed. Due to the new technologies in their construction and the delay in manufacturing the guns ashore, although they were laid down in 1879, the two ships wouldn't launch until spring 1882, and only actually entered service in 1886 and 1887, which meant they ended up entering service at almost the same time as the next two classes of ship, a coastal defence vessel and a significantly improved battleship design. The coastal defence ship would be an evolution of a previous design. The older design, which had been named Rupert, presumably calculated to strike fear into picnics everywhere but precious little else, would be superseded by a rather massive pendulum swing in the other direction, with the new class which was named Conqueror, and its companion ship the Hero. Although, of course, Conqueror, at least in my view, is a little bit of an odd choice to give to a vessel that's designed almost entirely for defensive purposes. The primary changes were the superstructure and the armament. The new design had a full superstructure that went from one beam to the other, running from approximately amidships all the way aft, as opposed to the smaller, rather more island-like structure which was found on Rupert. The main guns were, of course, the brand new breech loaders, and there was an extensive secondary battery included, as opposed to the mere pair of 64-pounders found on the earlier ship. Now there were 4 single 6-inch guns, half a dozen 6-pounders, 5 small 3-pounders, and several machine guns, a reflection of the rise of torpedo warfare and the need for an anti-torpedo boat battery. Notably, the 6-inch guns weren't part of the anti-torpedo boat battery because quick-firing technology had only reached the 6-pounder at this stage, although matters would continue to improve as time went on. The 6-inch guns were the beginning of a secondary anti-ship battery to target unarmoured areas. Speaking of torpedoes, though, there were half a dozen above-water torpedo tubes, interestingly, pretty much all arranged to fire in arcs that ran from a beam to aft, as the main attack vector of these ships was still ramming. But if the ramming attack missed, and with all the main guns forward, there was precious little firepower aft, and so the torpedo launchers were intended to give a sting in the tail if they happened to coast past an enemy vessel. There was also a second-class torpedo boat included in the ship's small complement of boats, which gave it a little independent attack unit, assuming they remembered to launch it in time. Armour consisted of 12 inches of compound armour on the turrets, central citadel and central belt, with 14 inches on the turret faceplate, 10.5 inches on the citadel bulkheads, and 8 inches on the belt's extremities. There was one issue, though. Although the ship was quite agile, the 4,500 indicated horsepower provided by the engines only allowed for a speed of 14 knots, which, when combined with their smaller size and low freeboard forward, meant that, unlike 28,000 years in the future, you very much could run from the Conqueror, either by simply being one of the new faster battleships and just outpacing it, or heading out into the open sea where its poor seakeeping would slow the coast defence ship still further. Viewed as something of an anachronism even when commissioned in 1887 by most naval officers, Conqueror would spend her 15 active years, along with 5 more in reserve, acting almost entirely as a gunnery tender, and was never really let out of sight of land. With Conqueror having been laid down in 1879, it was surprising even to many at the time when Hero was ordered as a supplement to her 5 years later. Her career would be somewhat similar, except that she would be sunk as a target in 1908 instead of being scrapped. The battleship that would succeed the Colossuses, on the other hand, would bring about the end of en-echelon turrets in the Royal Navy until the development of the battlecruiser over 2.5 decades down the line. This ship would be named Collingwood, and was the first attempt to directly address the French barbette ships as well as the Italia head-on. It was rather quickly established that the Royal Navy had very little intention of following the Italian experiment of not having any armour at all, and so attention was turned more towards the French designs, with their various barbette ships which allowed for the carriage of heavy guns somewhat higher than if they were installed in turrets. Melding the principles of the Devastation and Dreadnought designs with the recently launched Cayman-class French coastal defence ships, the idea was to have 2 large guns in barbettes, one fore and one aft, with a strong secondary battery installed in the superstructure between them. This idea had been percolating through the Royal Navy for some time, and so the initial sketches had used the 100-ton muzzle-loading rifle gun. But the new 12-inch breech-loading rifle gun was soon substituted in. A pear-shaped barbette was recommended, and this was actually based off the one found on Italia. The weight savings offered were considerable compared to a turret, as well as saving on the weight of armour, due to not having the sides and roof of a traditional turret, because the turntable now only needed to rotate the weight of the guns instead of also rotating the weight of the cylindrical turret and its roof. The machinery used for this rotation was now considerably smaller and needed less protection in terms of area, as well as, of course, being lighter. The guns, being carried higher, as a result could be fought in rougher sea conditions, and the gun crews had good situational awareness, they were less cramped, and the gun could be elevated and depressed at greater angles. It also marked something of a reversion back to the idea of a line of battle compared to the last decade or so where a head-only fire had been emphasised far more than broadside firepower. Additional guns came in the shape of half a dozen 6-inch guns, 3 per side, a dozen 6-pounders, and 14 smaller guns plus 4 torpedo tubes, with everything but some of the 12-pounders being positioned amidships between the two big gun emplacements. The main guns themselves would soon be doubled up to twin mountings as opposed to singles, giving a main broadside of 4 12-inch guns, with the armour consisting of 18 inches of compound armour at the maximum thickness of belt, 16 inches on the end bulkheads, and 11.5 inches on the barbettes. 7,000 indicated horsepower gave a top speed of just under 17 knots on forced draft and just under 16 knots normally. But Collingwood faced a fair amount of criticism, much of which was unfounded and made largely because she was new and innovative and people didn't like new and innovative things, but 3 issues did stick out. Firstly, there was only one of her, and there were quite a few of the newer foreign ships. Laid down in 1880, she wouldn't be ready until 1887. Second was her speed. A number of foreign ships were faster, and ideally the Royal Navy wanted to be able to chase down enemies who were running away from them. And thirdly, although the newer longer guns had meant a lot more energy, the widespread use of compound armour meant that even the 12-inch 45-ton gun would struggle with more recent ships' belt armour at 1,000 yards range. And thus came the call for more ships, and at first a new design was sought, 4 designs being offered. Design A was capable of 18 knots, so good for tracking enemies down, and came with a pair of 12-inch twin barbettes, one at each end, and a pair of single 16-inch guns in an ovoid barbette amidships with 1 gun per side. The sacrifice here was that the only armour was a protected deck. Design B reversed this, having single 16-inch guns at each end and a pair of 12-inch guns on each wing. Along with basic citadel armour, though, this reduced speed to 14.5 knots. Design C was basically a marginally faster version of Inflexible, with compound armour all over, with 4 16-inch guns in a pair of turrets en echelon amidships. Design D advanced the design of the Ironclad HMS Dreadnought, which had a pair of twin turrets, one at each end, only now with 16-inch guns and an armoured citadel, and was capable of 15 knots. Although of the same calibre as the 16-inch guns that could be found on Inflexible, the newer guns, of course, had the new longer barrels, and thus they could hit harder. It was also discovered that any of the single 16-inch gun installations could be replaced directly with a twin 12-inch with minimal change to weight or size, and of course vice versa. However, concerns over the open nature of barbettes, since rapid-fire secondary guns, often mounted high in a ship or even in the mast, were becoming more common, meant that initially Design D was selected, which had turrets, but now with twin 13.5-inch guns instead of 12-inch guns. The specification was for 14 knots and with no less than 20 inches of compound armour. Design options were now considered based on this that varied wildly, including one for a ship with 16 knots, with 16-inch guns, and 25 inches of compound armour. At this stage, it seemed the designers had perhaps lost a little bit of focus on chasing down the enemy in favour of building solid slabs of iron that they'd somehow managed to make float. However, the costs of these options were far too high, and soon the idea reverted back to, well, why don't we just build a repeat of Collingwood, only with either twin 12-inch or single 16-inch turrets instead of the barbettes, as they were still concerned about secondary fire. Or possibly one of each, whether you had the 16-inch forward or the 12-inch forward and the other type aft was still up for debate. Armour layout and machinery could be slightly improved, but then everybody changed their minds yet again, and finally 2 vessels would be ordered, with a main armament of 13.5-inch guns, back in twin barbettes, as they decided that maybe secondary fire wasn't such a concern after all. 1 barbette forward and 1 aft. This decision seemed to have been driven by equal parts desire for better penetration of the 13.5-inch guns versus the 12-inch, and simply because the French were fielding guns of roughly this size and the Royal Navy couldn't seem to be being behind. These 2 ships would be named Rodney and Howe. Secondary and anti-torpedo boat batteries consisted of a dozen 6-pounders and 10 3-pounders, plus a number of above-water single 14-inch torpedo tubes. The belt had a maximum thickness of 18 inches of compound armour, the barbettes were 11.5 inches thick, and the deck was up to 3 inches thick. Around 10,000 indicated horsepower gave a top speed of 16 knots via 2 screws, with another 1 to 1.5 knots possible if you went under forced draft. Displacement came in at just over 10,000 tons, and 2 further ships, Anson and Camperdown, would be ordered in the next financial year, with a slight change having 14 inches of barbette armour. The theoretical 17.5 knots of top speed under forced draft would give the ships the speed they needed to chase down most enemies, but delays over both the choice of armament and then the manufacture of those chosen guns meant that although the 4 ships were laid down in 1882 and 1883, they wouldn't actually enter service until 1888 and 1889. Once they were in service, it was noted that although the guns were carried significantly higher, their greater speed of the ships and the generally still quite low freeboard meant that if they were driving into a head sea of any great size, speed had to be reduced quite sharply, otherwise huge amounts of water would cascade down the interior of the barbette and start flooding various portions of the lower part of the ship. At one point it was reported that the magazine passageway was knee-deep in water, which wasn't really all that great. There would be one final variation of this hull though, and that would be Benbow. All of the other ships of the type were being built in the Royal Dockyards, but there was no longer any space in the Royal Dockyards due to the glut of ships that were still under construction, and so Benbow was put out to private contract. But with it looking increasingly like the Royal Ordnance Works would struggle to equip the other 4 ships with their 13.5-inch guns in time, Thames Ironworks, Benbow's builders, sought alternative armament as they didn't want the ship to be delayed and penalties applied. The choices being either mounting the older 12-inch guns as found in Collingwood, or mounting the new Elzig 110-ton 16.25-inch gun. And since not only was armour increasing, but the Italians had also already ordered the exact same 16.25-inch guns for their own ships, the larger gun was chosen, and 2 of these would be installed, one at each end, with the slight overall decrease in weight compared to twin 13.5s, allowing for the 6-inch battery to increase from 6 guns to 10 guns. Compared to her half-sisters, her rate of fire was considerably slower. It was hoped that this would be compensated for by the fact that a successful delivery of a 16.25-inch shell aboard the enemy would be considerably more devastating than a smaller 13.5-inch shell coming from one of the other ships. It was now the mid-1880s, and a series of further developments would change the Royal Navy's course yet again. There was a major war scare with Russia that brought more funding and a call for more ships, while the increasing capabilities of torpedoes and torpedo launch platforms brought about a proposed series of countermeasures. Firstly, in the form of torpedo nets, which it was initially hoped would be able to catch all incoming torpedoes in all circumstances, but which soon proved to be only useful when the ships were at anchor or moving very slowly, as the drag that they imposed meant that there would be massive speed penalties to any speed much above 5 knots. But also in this period would come the first recognisable proposals for a torpedo defence system. In this case, it called for somewhat thinning the belt armour and then using the spare weight to extend the belt deeper underwater, and then step it back with a thin armour layer applied to the inner side of a much deepened double bottom, which would then run all the way around and under the ship back up the other side. The idea being that a torpedo would strike the outer hull, explode, and then the explosion would dissipate into the void spaces of the double bottom, while any fragments and remaining blast would be stopped by the inner armour plate. Against the relatively small torpedo warheads of the time, it actually likely would have been relatively effective, but it was not proceeded with, as the additional depth of the double bottom meant raising the machinery to a point where it would be partially above the waterline, and the magazines would be closer to the waterline, both of which would then be more vulnerable to shell fire, especially given that the belt had just been made thinner to free up the weight for the armoured double bottom. And therefore ships would continue on without any effective torpedo defence system for roughly the next 3 decades or so. But regardless of this, new ships were in demand to try and scare off the Russians, and here there was something of a reaction against recent trends. When the middle 4 ships of the loosely termed Admiral class were being designed, there was a concern about the barbettes being swept of life by high-mounted secondary and tertiary guns, as we've discussed earlier. Between this and the desire to escalate gun size still further due to foreign ship armaments heading that way, The new design sought to retain the big 16.25-inch guns, but also to protect them and the gun crews more fully. Doing so in a layout similar to Benbow, with single guns fore and aft, but now in turrets, would cost far too much in terms of both weight and money for a ship big enough to support them, and so the general principle of the Conqueror class, that being all the main guns in a single turret up forward, was sought, but now applied to an ocean-going design. This gave us the Victoria and Sans Pareil. 6 designs were considered, of which the first and the fourth have not really survived in any great detail. The first seemed to have suggested simply a bigger version of Conqueror with 16.25-inch guns, but the lack of any firepower astern scuppered that. The second design addressed concerns about astern firepower by going back to the 13.5-inch gun, but adding a pair of single turrets, one on each side, which could then fire forward, aft, or broadside, along with the twin 13.5-inch turret forward, and it also suggested a huge secondary battery of no less than 22 6-inch guns and another 13 6-pounders. The third design was essentially an Admiral type with 13.5-inch guns except in turrets instead of barbettes, and with 2 secondary gun decks. The fourth design doesn't seem to have any real references to it surviving. The fifth design had twin 13.5-inch guns in a turret forward and 16 6-inch guns, but with some of them able to fire aft. But a handful of 6-inch guns firing aft wasn't considered to be enough, and so the sixth design came along and would eventually be the one that was built. This had twin 16.25-inch guns in a turret up front, a single 10-inch gun aft with just a gun shield, and a secondary battery of a dozen 6-inch guns on one level in the superstructure, 6 guns per side, the same number of 6-pounders on an open deck above the 6-inch battery, and then another dozen 3-pounders, as well as 8 machine guns, in higher positions such as the fighting tops and atop the bridge. There were also many torpedo tubes. Above-water tubes could be found at the bow, the stern, and on either side, and there were additional underwater tubes on either side just forward of the citadel as well. Armour consisted of an 18-inch belt and citadel, with 16 inches on the fore and aft bulkheads. The turrets had 17 inches of armour, and there was a mixture of 3-inch and 6-inch armour protecting the 6-inch gun deck, the 6-inch armour being on the forward end of the gun deck to protect against raking fire. Despite the immense weight of guns and armour, the use of vertical triple expansion engines for the first time meant that the ships were still capable of 16 knots normally, and reached almost 18 knots under forced draft. Laid down in 1885, they only commissioned at the start of the 1890s, again due to issues in supplying the guns. Victoria would of course famously be sunk by Camperdown in the Mediterranean. The penultimate ironclads would be the Trafalgar class. While all previous ironclads had been designed to be under 10,000 tons, although one or two had just crept over that, these ships would be allowed to utilise just over 12,000 tons displacement, and this allowed a combination of the older dreadnought-style layout with the third design that had been put forward as an idea for the Victorias, this thus resulting in a ship that had a pair of twin 13.5-inch turrets, as opposed to barbettes, one fore and one aft, with a central lightly armoured secondary battery of 6 4.7-inch guns. This was an unusual departure, but quick-firing technology had recently reached up to guns of this size, and so it was thought that they would be better than slower-firing 6-inch guns. Plus, there were 8 6-pounder guns, 9 3-pounder guns, and a few machine guns. There were, of course, also torpedo tubes, 1 fore, 1 aft, and 2 on each side, and in the latter case, 1 was above and 1 was below the waterline. Armour was no less than 20 inches of compound armour on the lower belt over the machinery, thinning down by stages to 18 inches and then 14, with a smaller upper belt of 16-inch thickness that formed a citadel around the armament, with 18-inch plates around the base of the turrets. The turrets themselves were also 18 inches thick, thus making the Trafalgars the most heavily protected British capital ships up to that point in terms of weight of armour relative to overall displacement, and well in the running for some of the most heavily protected ships in terms of displacement proportional to weight of armour, with 33.5% of their displacement just being inert metal designed to stop incoming shells. With a similar power plant to the Victorias, they were only capable of 12 knots normally and just under 17 on forced draft, but thanks to the improving situation with gun manufacture, although they were laid down in 1886, they actually commissioned at about the same time as the Victorias. The latter part of the 1880s had brought about two more major changes. Sir William White had come on board fully as Director of Naval Construction, and after quite a lot of political shenanigans, the two-power standard was formally adopted. That is, that the Royal Navy was now mandated to be strong enough to fight both of the next two largest navies combined, with some headroom to spare. This, of course, required a significant increase in fleet size, and this would in turn lead to the first truly mass-produced class of battleships of the Royal Navy in the Ironclad era, with the class also being the last Ironclads built in British service, as soon thereafter Harvey and then Krupp steel would usher in the age of what we would now call pre-dreadnoughts. This last Ironclad class would be the Royal Sovereigns. The starting point was the Trafalgar class, but with an aim to have a considerably higher freeboard at 11.5 feet. The armament was to be broadly the same, with protection also roughly similar, as apart from higher freeboard, the other aim was to make speed greater. The aim was to reach 17 knots. For this, it was suggested that up to 16,000 tons would be accepted as displacement. To get to this targeted speed value, there'd need to be a 70% increase in machinery power. That involved, of course, a larger citadel because the machinery would need to be protected, which meant more armour, which meant more weight, and a change to seek the largest possible secondary and tertiary armament as quick-firing technology had now reached 6-inch gun level also would increase weight. There was then a great argument over whether these ships should have turrets or barbettes, to the point that each of the 5 design variants proposed came in both barbette and turret versions. Eventually, though, the majority of officers favoured the barbette option, and this would be proceeded with, although the turret faction, which was led by the first Sea Lord, technically first Naval Lord at that point, Arthur Hood, was allowed a small victory in that of the 8 proposed ships, although 7 would be of the barbette design, the 8th vessel would have turrets, allowing a true side-by-side comparison, and the latter vessel would be named Hood. Some compromises in the design due to the ever-increasing costs would have to be made, and in the end the ships emerged with 4 13.5-inch guns in twin barbette mounts, one fore and one aft, except of course for Hood where they're in turrets, a secondary and tertiary battery of no less than 10 quick-firing 6-inch guns, 16 6-pounders, and 12 3-pounders for a total of 38 non-primary guns, not including machine guns, plus 7 torpedo tubes, 2 submerged forward, 2 above water on each side, and 1 above water astern. The belt ended up being a fraction thinner than the Trafalgar's at 18 inches thick, with 12-inch thick barbettes, but the armour covered a significantly greater area, and the secondary battery enjoyed its own 6-inch casement armour. Speed was 15.5 knots under normal conditions, and around a knot to a knot and a half faster when forced, although some ships managed considerably faster speeds both on trials and in service. There was actually a great deal of variety in the various ships' top speeds, all achieved on a displacement of just over 14,000 tons. Some small amounts of steel armour were found higher up in thinner portions of the tertiary battery, which was a bit of a harbinger of things to come. In an effort to reduce top weight and improve stability, the upper portion of the hull was given a degree of tumble home, and all ships bar Empress of India and Hood would receive names starting with R. Hood herself, while a generally useful vessel, proved to be considerably less seaworthy than her half-sisters, as the extra weight of the turret meant that she had a considerably lower freeboard. And thus would end the era of the ironclad warship in the Royal Navy, at least using a definition where iron makes up the entirety, or later on the bulk, of a ship's armour, once they moved on to compound armour. It also marked the end of the era of the traditionally turreted warship in the Royal Navy, going by the original definition where you have a cylindrical fully armoured gunhouse which extends down into the hull. All subsequent Royal Navy ships would have barbettes, initially moving from open ones to those with plated-in gun houses. At first, this was for basic protection against wind and waves, as well as small caliber gunfire and splinters, but gradually those gun houses would become more and more heavily protected and would then take on the nomenclature of turret, although it was now an armoured rotating gun house of a variety of shapes and sizes, with a fixed cylindrical barbette beneath. No future Royal Navy capital ship would have iron-based armour all the way across its protection scheme. Admittedly, there was the second-class battleships of the Centurion class, which would still have a compound armour belt, with steel over iron, but significant portions of its armour elsewhere would be of the new Harvey steel, and thus they don't fully count, at least in my book. The next second-class battleship, the Renown, as well as the next first-class battleships, the Majestics, would all have Harvey steel, face-hardened, and without any iron backing. And so, half a decade after we started this series, we can draw a curtain on the development of ironclad battleships in the Royal Navy, and that of course means next year we can start looking at everybody else's ironclads.
That's it for this video. Thanks for watching. If you have a comment or suggestion for a ship to review, let us know in the comments below. Don't forget to comment on the pinned post for dry dock questions.